exactly who she is, but some of you know from her recent primary election where she's going. And then we'll hear from Jim Verity, our SRO representative, and then we'll take questions. Okay, Angie?
Hi everybody, can you hear me? Good afternoon. I'm shorter than most. So I am Angie Gallo, and I feel like the luckiest girl in the world. I was just elected to be a school board member for Orange County Public Schools. So come November, I will be representing District 1 for the county school board in Orange County. I am also the Vice President of Education Development for the Florida PTA. I am the former legislative chair, which is kind of how Patty and I got to meet. And I'll go into that briefly because I want to get to the crux of why I'm here, which is the Guardian program. And I sit on the Education Committee for the League of Women Voters in Orange County, so I am a league member. And I do, as mentioned, sit on the steering committee for the Florida Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. So for the last several years, since Patty and I started talking even prior to Pulse, the Florida PTA and the League of Women Voters was working together to try to figure out how we could collaborate on common sense gun reform so that we could keep our citizens, our kids, and our communities safe from the pervasive gun violence that we see everywhere. And it's not just in schools. And I know that we're focused on schools today because of Guardian program. But as the VP of Educational Development for the Florida PTA, I believe I would be remiss if I didn't mention that gun violence exists in every part of our state. And our children are getting murdered daily at an alarming rate. And they're afraid to leave their houses, and they're afraid to go to school. Not because the schools aren't safe, but because they have to get to the schools, they have to walk to the schools. And they're just living in unsafe environments. And until we do a deep dive and we start unpackaging why this is happening, we're never going to come to the solution. And the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence believes that there's two ways that we can make our state safer, and one of them is the ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, which the Florida PTA supports. And the other one is to close that gun show loophole so that everybody who purchases a firearm has to go through a background check so that we make sure that these firearms aren't getting into the hands of people that shouldn't have them, into the hands of people that are mentally ill. And it's not just for the safety of our community, but it's a safety for them as well, because gun suicide is one of the highest rates, and Patty could probably shout out the statistics quicker than I can. But I know that it's high, and we need to keep everybody safe. So with that said, Dr. Griffin mentioned the Guardian program, which passed in the legislature this last school year. I'm going to try to briefly go over it with you just so you know. He's now explained to you what's happened going on in Seminole County, which is going on across the state. And this is the reason why some of these things are happening. And most districts like Seminole County did start implementing hardening structures, putting SROs in schools and other things that they need to do right after what happened in Sandy Hook, because we all saw a need to try to keep our kids safe. So 7026. 7026 was a very large bill. It came in the last 3 weeks of the legislative session as a direct result of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting. It was a 105-page bill that appropriated $400 million. Right after the shooting, as vigils were being held, as funerals were being attended, the legislature came together to try to find some common sense solutions to stop tragedies like this from happening again. And Governor Scott held a workshop with all members of the community. The Florida PTA did have a seat at that table. I sat on the educational workshop where we discussed some of the problems that we are having in the schools in terms of school safety. And I'm happy to say that almost everything that was discussed, because there was parents, there was guidance counselors, there were SROs, superintendents, there was a lot of stakeholders in that workshop that was given their opinion. Most of that was incorporated into this bill. Governor Scott did call for $500 million. We only got $400 million, and he was against the Guardian program, which we all know was rolled into this bill. But it did give us $400 million, and what specifically it will do is it raises the minimum age of a firearm from 18 to 21. Currently, it was only handheld guns that were 21 to purchase, and now it's long guns as well. It requires a 3-day waiting period on all guns with very few exceptions. And that wasn't the case previously. It bans the purchase or possession of bump fire stocks, which allows semi-automatic weapons to fire like a fully automatic. The bump stock is what the Las Vegas shooter used to make his, I think it was his AR-15 fully automatic, and it was the reason he caused such damage and such carnage with that shooting. There we go. It also has, and a lot of these were standalone bills that existed already. We were, the legislature, certain legislators were already fighting for a lot of the bills that were roll into this one, so they existed, and they just took the language and put it into this bill. It has extreme risk protection order, which will allow law enforcement officers to ask courts to temporarily prohibit someone from possessing or purchasing a firearm or ammunition. This wasn't in place before, and since this has happened, we've had 24 cases, 50, I don't even know what the number is now, but immediately after this law went into effect, cops were allowed to go into the homes and actually take guns away in high-risk situations where people were in jeopardy of hurting themselves or hurting others. It provides more funding for mental health services and school resource officers. It did create the Aaron Feist Guardian Program. We, like the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence and the Legal Women Voters, were extremely against this provision. We were able, along with others, to get it watered down. So the initial was that that teachers would be armed, and then they watered it down to say only non-classroom teachers. Our contention with that was there's a lot of teachers that would be categorized as non-classroom teachers because anybody who is a club sponsor, who is a coach, who does anything other than just teach a class for 6 to 7 periods would be considered a non-classroom teacher. So that was the issue that we had with that, and we believe to this day that teachers are there to teach our children. It is not their responsibility to keep our kids safe. It's incumbent upon the state as a whole and law enforcement to keep our children safe. It requires the Department of Education to procure a mobile suspicious activity reporting app, which they're in the process of doing. It's going to be called Fortify Florida. They're working on it now, and I believe I heard that should launch within the next 2 weeks. It creates the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Commission. I'm sure you guys have been listening or hearing in the newspaper. They started meeting this past summer, I think really in the spring. And their job is to look at all the evidence, look at everything that happened at MSD, and come up with proposals on how to prevent it in the future. It requires emergency drills to include active shooter and hostage situations in all school districts. It requires school districts to establish safety and security best practices and to designate a school administrator and school safety specialist for the district, and those should be in place in all districts by now. It creates a threat assessment teams to coordinate resources and assessments and intervention with individuals that may pose a threat. This is something similar to what the FBI currently does, is where they're trying to get ahead of any type of threats that may come against our schools. So like they do it, like they watch social media, they look at all kinds of different parameters, and they determine who might be a threat or might not be a threat and intervene prior to them acting on whatever they may be planning. And we've had some things across the state, some instances thwarted in different middle schools and high schools due to this. Okay, so here's a timeline by Governor Scott. Most of this has been put in place, but he released this summer. The public safety, by May 1st, the Department of Education had to hire a newly created Office of Safe Schools, a director. They did that. I can't remember the gentleman's name. I know his first name is Dean. He has an extensive background from the FBI. Upon 7026 becoming law, the DOE immediately began working to implement active shooter training so that this is the Guardian program, each teacher, student, faculty member, and school officer knows what to do during a crisis. This training must be done every semester. So, this is in addition to those districts that may participate in the Guardian program. By July 21st, the superintendents had to designate a school safety specialist, so that's been done. And I'll go through all this, but what's the most important thing to know is that a lot of, I think, parents and teachers thought that they would come to school on the first day of school and they would see all of these things would have been in place, right? The hardening of schools, the single point entryway, a lot of these things. A lot of the money that has come down from this legislation is in the form of a grant. So there's timelines. So the school district needed time to actually apply for the grant. Then the grant goes to the Department of Education. The Department of Education will approve or deny or decide how much money to get each district, and then the money funnels down. And the deadline for most of this isn't even until January. So most of the money coming down for hardening and different things, we won't see probably till after January, till the February timeframe. So by the time it gets implemented and the school districts play catch up and are able to do some of those things, we're looking at the beginning of the next school year. So this just says, where was I? Okay, the school districts must complete a security risk assessment for each public school campus. They must do this before they can even apply for that $99 million that is going towards the hardening of schools. I don't know how many districts in the state of Florida have completed that task yet. Some have brought in a separate entity, some are doing it amongst themselves, but I'm not certain where we stand with each district in the state of Florida or here in Seminole County. Dr. Griffin could answer that question, and maybe a school board member if that's a question you guys want to answer as well. Before the start of this school year, the DAE began to identify a security consulting firm for the independent third-party review of the Florida Safe Schools assessment tools. By September, each school should have established a threat assessment team with the expertise in mental health counseling, academic instruction, law enforcement, school administration that will meet monthly to review any potential threats to student staff at school. So as you can see, this was an extremely comprehensive bill where we were looking at the safety of the school, the hardening of the school, the mental health aspect of it, making sure we had guidance counselors so that they could fill the needs of the children. One of the biggest complaints in the workshop that I attended with Governor Scott was the mental health aspect. And there was no cross-pollination of information. So one organization wasn't speaking to another organization, wasn't speaking to another organization, which is why the shooter in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was allowed to fall through the cracks. Everybody knew about him. All these different agencies were looking into them, but nobody was communicating with each other. And there's provisions of this bill that now require inter-organizations communications. But I remember at the workshop, we had the top guidance counselor of the year, she was guidance counselor of the year, when asked, can you do your job? And she said, well, what do you mean? They go, well, how many hours in a week, in a typical school week, are you allowed to actually counsel children, that you're in front of children and you're helping children? And she said, in a typical week? And they said, yeah. And she goes, maybe a half a day. A half a day. Her job is there for our children, and yet because of the rules and some of the legislation that's come down, our guidance counselors are spending less than a half a day, maybe possibly even one day with our children in school counseling them. And that's unacceptable, and that's why so much money is being put into mental health, because we recognize without solving the mental health issue, we're never going to solve them. You know, they go in hand. We have to get the assault weapons off our streets, and we need background checks on everybody. That's a given, because without that happening, the mental health piece won't work either. They go kind of hand in hand with one another. So let's see what else we got. So I'm probably running short on time. So here's just the funding, the breakdown for those of you who want to get into the weeds. $69 million were appropriated for mental health assistance. $1 million was for the design and construction of a memorial honoring the students and those lives lost at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Over $25 million to replace Building 12, because that's the building that was hit and they're going to be tearing it down. $67 million for the Sheriff's Office to establish the Guardian Program. $97 million for the Safe School allocation, and this is what I refer to as a grant. That's in the form of grant money. And this is on top of the $64 million that's already in the budget that they had. So they more than tripled the amount of money that will go for safe schools. And I actually misspoke. That's not in the form of grant money. That money's just been being given. It's the $98 million for the hardening and securing of the school buildings that comes in the form of grant that school districts have to apply for. And then $18.3 million for DCS mobile crisis teams, I should say teams, excuse me, to ensure access among counties. They're actually going to have mobile crisis unit teams that travel out to the more rural areas that don't have the services that some of the more suburban areas like Seminole and Orange County have to offer. And you can't read this, but I put this in there. This is just our budget. And I'm only pointing this out is because the 726 bill was approved and it dropped a day before the budget dropped. And the legislative actually had to extend session by a day because there's a rule that you have to lay the budget on hand for 72 hours. It's called a cooling off period before they can approve it. And they didn't meet that deadline, so they did have to serve one more day up in Tallahassee. But we didn't know what the budget looked like when 7026 dropped. And we were told by the governor, not the legislature to be fair, that he would not rob from Peter to pay Paul. That our kids would get a great education and they will be safe in school. Well, they did exactly that. They did rob from Peter to pay Paul, because when the budget dropped, our base student allocation, which is the most flexible part of the budget that the school district gets to use, was at 47 cents. And in some districts, if you put in like the inflation or what they call the cost differential, some districts got 3 cents. So they did rob from Peter Pay Paul, and I'm sure these school board members that are in the audience today will tell you that they had to take money out of the classroom to pay for these SROs and some of the other hardening that they were required to do by law. So again, this is what I was referring to as the base student allocation. They tout that they gave us over $100 in the FEFP or the FTE, which they did. However, as Dr. Griffin mentioned, they're in different silos, or what we call categorical, so that you can only use them for certain things, and it's not within the flexible part of their budget. And then I wanted to share with you this because Dr. Griffin mentioned it as well, and then I'll close up. Out of the 58 million, out of the 69 million for the 67 million for the Guardian program, only 9-point-something million was used. So only those districts, very few districts came forth and says we're going to use a Guardian program. Those who did come forth, they're not arming teachers. They've hired security officers to come to be on their campuses, and they put them through the Guardian program and they placed them on campus. Orange County chose not to do that, and we all know Seminole County chose not to do that. But it did leave us with $58 million left in the Guardian program. And the Superintendent's Association, along with others, sent letters to Governor Scott to ask them to please reallocate those dollars back so that we could use this for school hardening to help us meet the costs that we need. And then Scott then sent a letter to the Legislative Budget Commission. When the legislation is not in office, the Joint Legislative Budget Commission has it within their purview to rearrange some of those dollars that have been allocated from one budget line item to the other. So Governor Scott did call on them to please take that $58 million that's left over and throw it into the school safety that was at $97 million, I believe, to give the districts more flexibility on how to use those dollars. The LBC met on September 14th, and incoming leader, Senate President Galvano, as well as incoming House designee Speaker of the House, Jose Oliva, both said no, that they wouldn't do it. They refused to agenda the item. It wasn't discussed, and they said that they wanted to leave that money there because the program hadn't had a chance to take off yet, and there may be districts that needed to use it. So instead of giving that money back into a fund that would give the districts flexibility, they're choosing to keep it where it is, and it will go unused for the rest of the year unless some school districts decide in January, February that they're going to start using the Guardian program, which in my humble opinion is unlikely. So you can't see this, but this is what it meant for each district. So like for Seminole County, so Seminole County is down, this is really bad. I think there's Seminole. In Seminole County, it meant, like, well, I can't read it real well, $1.4 million. For Orange County, oh, there you go. For, it was 1.6, it was a differential of almost $1 million you would have gotten back. For Orange County, it was like 5.5. For Miami-Dade, it was a difference of $8.5 million that they could have used for the hardening of their schools. So we're talking about real money and dollars that should have gone back to our schools for the flexibility. So that's the Guardian program in a nutshell. Hopefully I didn't bore you to tears. Thank you.